Taseo is a small nation in the east. The Yol people are descendants of a maiden from the heavens who fell in love with a mortal. Their beauty led to their downfall, as they were exploited by humans, leading to a decline in their numbers. The last surviving daughter of the Yol is summoned by the emperor to serve in his harem. The emperor is with a mistress in bed. His mistress notices he's in a good mood, and he tells her that he's awaiting a guest. The chief eunuch comes to inform the emperor about the arrival of a Yol girl, and the emperor tells his mistress to leave. The chief eunuch tries to inform the emperor that there's a problem, but the emperor dismisses the eunuch's concerns and orders him to bring in the Yol girl. Seon is announced as a concubine, the lowest-ranking woman in the emperor's harem. His mistress remains in a corner of the room, observing. When the emperor sees Seon, he explodes in anger. Her face is completely scarred on one side. The emperor asks the eunuch why he brought a wrong woman. The eunuch falls on his knees and explains that Seon's mother scarred her daughter's face in anger when she heard the emperor's order. The emperor is in disbelief that a woman would do such to her daughter. Seon immediately falls to her knees beside the chief eunuch. She begs the emperor to have mercy on her mother. The king bursts into a maniac laughter, then he orders the eunuch to kill Seon because she's an abomination. He goes on to request for all the Yol women to be brought to him, including Seon's mother. Seon trembles in fear with her face to the ground. The eunuch fearfully informs the emperor that Seon is the last of the Yol women. After Seon was taken, the remaking Yol people committed suicide. The emperor freezes in cold fury. Seon turns to the eunuch in shock to ask him if her mother is dead. The eunuch begs Seon not to raise her voice in the emperor's presence. The emperor grabs his sword and kills the mistress cowering in his room. He announces that she defied his order after he asked her to leave. Seon looks away from the sight in fear, and the emperor turns to address the eunuch. He orders him to search for Yul survivors, and until then, Seon can be kept alive. This begins the tragic story of the last surviving Yul. 10 years later, Seolha Seon is still in the emperor's quarters. She's doing some weeding when her nursemaid, Unjeong, calls her. She addresses Seon as my lady, and Seon reminds Unjeong to address her as Seolha when they are alone. Unjeong points out that Seon is the emperor's concubine, and Seon says that her position is not relevant. Unjeong notices that Seon's hair is messy, so she tells Seon to sit and allow her to braid the hair. Unjeong says she'll finish the rest of the chores for Seon. As Unjeong braids Seon's hair, they discuss. Seon tells Unjeong that she'd soon be able to leave the palace. The only way a concubine can leave the palace is to become a nun. The both of them fantasize about life outside the palace. They make plans to celebrate once they make it out, to reward themselves for everything they've been through. Once Unjeong finishes braiding Seon's hair, Seon asks her if her mother scarred her face to help her survive in the palace. Unjeong doesn't know what to say to that, so she tells Seon that it won't be long before she's finally free. They hug each other for comfort. Seon vents to Unjeong. She shares with her that she's tired of enduring the emperor's tyranny and the scorn from the courtiers. Unjeong strokes Seon's hair as she listens. Seon promises to endure everything. She hopes that the emperor doesn't defile her the next time he summons her to his chambers. That way, she'll be able to leave the palace and become a nun. Unjeong and Seon promise themselves they'll go far away and never return. Suddenly, trumpets sound to announce the arrival of Prince Muan from battle. Seon asks Unjeong if it's Prince Muan they call the demon, and Unjeong hushes her. She tells Seon that the walls have ears. Seon laughs. She tells Unjeong that she knows when to keep her mouth shut, because she wants to live a long life together with Unjeong. Unjeong still insists that Seon be careful. Just then, a eunuch runs into the court looking for Seon. He informs her that she has been summoned by the emperor. Seon watches the eunuch in fear. Seon kneels before the emperor and awaits his orders. Instead, the emperor turns to a concubine by his side and starts speaking to her. He asks her if the sight of Seon is enough to ruin her appetite. The concubine agrees that Seon's face is a terrifying sight. She says that it would haunt her dreams. The emperor commands Seon to raise her head. He informs Seon that the concubine by his side has been overeating, so he summoned her to use her face to remedy the situation. The other concubines in the room burst into laughter, and Seon bows her head in shame. The emperor joins in the laughter. He tells Seon that her bizarre face always amuses him because one half is beautiful, and the other half is grotesque. The emperor announces to the room of women that he has tried to lay with Seon every night, because it's a tragedy to lose an entire clan of beautiful women. But no matter how he tries to cover Seon's face, the ugly side is always too visible, and it makes him lose interest. The other concubines beg the emperor to send Seon away. They complain that she stinks, and her existence is an embarrassment to the royal concubines. Seon attempts to defend herself, but the emperor silences her. Suddenly, he has a thought. He gets up from his seat and approaches Seon. He asks her if she wishes to leave the palace, and Seon fearfully says yes. The emperor says that if he's too disgusted to make Seon pregnant, then someone else should. He pulls her face upwards so she can look at him. Seon quickly puts her face to the floor. She begs the emperor to allow her to become a nun, and he interrupts her in anger. He pulls her by the hair and informs her that it is impossible to let her go, because she brings him more joy than the rest of his concubines. He pulls Seon's hair and forces her to look at him. He asks her if she wouldn't want a taste of womanhood. Furthermore, he demands that she provides him an answer. Seon pleads with the emperor that she only wishes to be a nun. A eunuch interrupts them and announces the arrival of Prince Muan. The emperor dismisses Seon in boredom and pushes her aside. As Seon runs out of the room, the emperor stops her, saying he has changed his mind. He grabs Seon from behind, then he forces her to watch his twin brother, Prince Muan, climbing the stairs. The emperor whispers in Seon's ears that Prince Muan is the only man alive that can breach his harem with his soldiers in tow. He informs Seon that he has heard the people whispering rumors that the late emperor mistook him for his twin and willed him the throne. He proceeds to tell Seon how he killed those people who whispered the rumors, and Seon listens in fear. The emperor asks Seon if she's afraid, then he confirms that the other concubines have been telling lies because Seon smells nice. Despite her hideous face, he buries his face in her neck to smell her. Prince Muon calls out to the emperor, and the emperor releases Seon to leave. As Seon passes Prince Muon, he respectfully acknowledges her. Seon bows her head and tries to hurry past, but Prince Muon notices her face. Seon hurriedly tries to apologize, and Muon pities her. He says her scar looks painful, and that she's brave. Seon turns to look at Muon, but he excuses himself. Seon bows to Muon's soldiers as she runs. The concubines in the court ask the emperor to take Seon as the new jester. They claim she'll be a far more talented fool than the current one. Muon's soldier asks if all the royal concubines speak with such venom, and Seon tells him that it seems so. As she leaves the negative comments behind, Seon continues recalling Muon's words to her. He said her scar looked painful, and she is brave. Muon enters the court and faces his twin brother, and the emperor stares at him in anger. Seon returns to her quarters and Unjeong rushes to her worriedly. She asks Seon if she's okay and Seon laughs, assuring Unjeong that she's all right. Unjeong hugs Seon in relief. When they let go of each other, Seon tells Unjeong that she ran into Prince Muan. She smiles as she recounts Muon's words to her. Unjeong watches Seon in surprise. Seon goes ahead to ask Unjeong if her scar is fading properly. Unjeong leans closer to Seon, and she tells her to give the scar a little more time. The door creaks open and both of them turn towards the sound. A young eunuch peeks through and Seon and Unjeong are happy to see him. The young eunuch, Hoyong comes in carrying sweets. Seon and Unjeong sit at a table with Hoyong. As Hoyong eats, Seon tells him it's okay for him to stop by her quarters at any time without bringing gifts. She doesn't want him to get into trouble. Hoyong makes some gestures with his hands and Unjeong watches him confused. Seon smoothly interprets Hoyong's gestures. She translates to Unjeong that the sweets are leftovers saved for the eunuchs from concubine Shin's tea. Unjeong is impressed by Seon's translation. As Seon starts to reply her, she's interrupted by the arrival of concubine Shin and her attendants. Concubine Shin accuses Hoyong of stealing from her. Hoyong immediately falls on his knees to plead with concubine Shin. Concubine Shin faces Seon instead, and Seon reminds Shin that she's in her quarters. In anger, concubine Shin tells Seon that Hoyong has been stealing food and jewelries from her, and now she has caught him taking his looting to Seon's quarters. Seon defends Hoyong. She notifies concubine Shin that Hoyong took pity on her and came to share his portion of sweets with her. Concubine Shin replies that Hoyong is better off pitying himself, and she stomps on his head. She commands her attendants to take Hoyong away. Concubine faces Hoyong and announces that he would lose his hands and be cast out of the palace. Seon quickly gets up and rushes to concubine Shin. She begs Shin to forgive Hoyong, because he is a child who cannot speak. Seon says that if concubine Shin takes away his hands too, it would be a death sentence for Hoyong. Seon proceeds to beg concubine Shin to punish her instead of Hoyong. Concubine Shin sneers at Seon. She leans into whispers to Seon, then she asks Seon if she enjoyed the show last time. Shin proceeds to recount how the emperor forced Seon to watch his intimate moment with her. She makes jest of Seon and asks her how she can live with the shame. She declares she'd rather die than suffer such disrespect. Seon agrees with concubine Shin. She says everything is her fault. Then she begs Shin to forgive Hoyong. Concubine Shin orders for Hoyong to be given 50 strokes of the cane in respect of Seon's status as her fellow concubine. However, she jeers that Hoyong might not even survive the 50 strokes. Seon immediately drops to the ground, and Unjeong watches her in disbelief. She kneels before concubine Shin, and begs Shin to show Hoyong mercy. Concubine Shin sneers at Seon on the ground. She asks Seon if she has no shame. Seon admits that she has no shame, and her only shame would result from a failure to protect Hoyong's life. The attendants around begin to murmur. Concubine Shin regards Seon for a moment, then she instructs the guards to reduce Hoyong's strokes to 30. Apparently, Seon's shamelessness has accounted for the remaining 20 strokes. Seon remains on her knees and thanks concubine Shin. Hoyong is taken away and stripped in preparation for his caning. Seon begs Hoyong to survive. She reminds him of his brother who went to battle, and she begs him to survive. Hoyong's caning begins and Seon looks away. Within moments, Hoyong starts to bleed from the caning. After it's over, Seon and Unjeong hurry over to Hoyong and take him indoors. They try to rouse him, but he remains slumped on the ground. Seon begins to panic. She moves around searching for a solution and Unjeong watches her in concern. Seon picks a knife and brings it up. Unjeong cries out to her to stop, and Seon says she's the only one that can save Hoyong. She points the knife to her chest and says she has to do it. Long ago, a curious maiden of the heavens descended to the earth, where she happened upon a mortal who had been fatally stabbed. The heavenly maiden cut her flesh and gave the man her blood to drink, for it contained the power to heal all wounds. The Yul were her descendants, and one of them, Seolha Seon, was the only one who inherited her enchanted blood. Seon slits her wrist and allows her blood to drop into Hoyong's mouth. She urges him to drink it so he can survive. After giving Hoyong her blood, Seon watches him worriedly. She cleans him up and allows him to rest, then Unjeong helps her to bind her bleeding wrist. Seon tells Unjeong that it takes humans longer to recover. She informs Unjeong that she was the first human she tried to heal. Before that, it was only wild animals. Seon reminds Eunjeong that it took her 3 days to recover, but Eunjeong is still worried. She advises Seon not to do it often. Seon tells her that Hoyeong has a family, and it would break their hearts if anything happened to him. Seon says she won't allow that tragedy to happen, and she clasps Eunjeong's hands. Eunjeong still looks at her worriedly. Seon goes outside for a walk, and she hears someone calling her outside the fence. She sees a hand waving over the fence, and she goes closer to investigate. Seon recognizes the man behind the fence. He's a gamekeeper. They exchange pleasantries, and the gamekeeper notices Seon's voice sounds unnaturally low. He asks her if she is okay, and Seon assures him that she's fine. She tells him there's nothing for him to worry about. The gamekeeper informs Seon that he caught a rabbit a few days ago, and set aside some of it for her. He also added some vegetables to go with it. He drops them for Seon in a wrapped cloth, and she picks it up. She thanks the man for being generous, even though his generosity could get him in trouble. The man assures Seon that it's nothing. He tells her that she reminds him of his daughter. He hopes that one day Seon can teach his daughter to read and write. Seon says she will be honored to help. Just then, a loud voice calls out to the gamekeeper outside the fence. The owner of the voice demands to know why an outsider is whispering through the fence with one of the emperor's concubines. Seon freezes in horror because she recognizes the voice. It is Prince Muan. The gamekeeper tries to explain himself to Prince Muan, and Seon thinks quickly. She realizes that if she gets caught, she will be putting the man in even more danger. So she decides to sneak away quietly. When she's far enough from the fence, she breaks into a run. She's almost to her room when someone grabs her from behind and carries her. She struggles to be free, but the hand holds on tight. Prince Muon drops her in front of him. And when he sees her face, he's surprised. He politely tells Seon it's good to see her again. Seon immediately moves in front of the gamekeeper to defend the man. She shields him from Prince Muon and announces that the gamekeeper is innocent. Seon tells Prince Muon that the gamekeeper is just a kind soul who was generous enough to help a starving concubine. Prince Muon is surprised that anybody would risk their lives to deliver a hunk of meat. He asks the gamekeeper if he is not aware of the risk. Then he leans closer to observe Seon's face. He tells Seon she has grown more haggard since the last time they met. Seon pleads with Prince Muon to show mercy. Prince Muon asks her on whom. He tells Seon that if she pleads for her life, then he will turn a blind eye to the incident. Seon's mind begins to race. She wonders if Prince Muan would really keep his word. But then, she refuses to trust him because she's sure he is just like his brother, the emperor. Instead, Seon threatens Prince Muon. She informs him that if he kills the gamekeeper, she will confess before the emperor that he attempted to rape her and murder the man who tried to stop him. She proceeds to tell Prince Muon that he will be brought to justice for coveting the emperor's woman. Prince Muon scoffs. He turns to his guards and mentions to them that Seon might be the fiercest creature he has ever met. They nod their heads in agreement. Seon notifies Prince Muon that if she is going to die, then she will bring him down with her. Prince Muon asks Seon if she thinks the emperor would believe her. Seon tries to gather her thoughts. She knows that Prince Muon is toying with her. She remembers his words to her the first time they met, when he told her scar looked painful and called her brave. She still refuses to hope or believe anything good from him. Furthermore, she holds onto the meat from the gamekeeper, and she starts to cry. Prince Muon sees Seon's tears, and it gives him have a change of heart. He instructs his guards to give the gamekeeper a stern warning and let him go. The gamekeeper bows in appreciation, as he hurriedly leaves with the guards. Seon stops crying, and she's relieved that no harm would come to the gamekeeper. She suddenly staggers from exhaustion, and Prince Muon hurriedly steadies her. He proceeds to tease Seon, telling her that he could change his mind at any time. Seon threatens to frame him for rape if he harms the gamekeeper. Prince Muan hugs Seon and asks her if a hug counts as rape. Seon quickly pulls back from the hug and tells Prince Muan to let her go. She gulps in fear. Prince Muan raises his hands in mock surrender and smiles teasingly. Seon turns around to face her quarters exhausted, and Prince Muan asks her if she needs assistance. Seon reluctantly admits that she will be grateful if Prince Muan escorts her to her quarters. He picks her up and carries her. Seon begs Prince Muan to put her down because if someone sees them, it would result in punishment from the emperor. Prince Muan assures Seon that if anyone sees them, he'd kill them before they get a chance to scream. He opens the gates to her quarters and carries her in. Unjeong sees them and falls on her face. She mistakes Prince Muan for the emperor. When Prince Muan puts down Seon, Seon informs Unjeong that it's Prince Muan, and not the emperor. Unjeong watches Prince Muan in disbelief. His resemblance to the emperor is striking. Seon bows to Prince Muan, and thanks him for all he has done for her in one night. As she's wishing him good night, he takes off his belt and Seon looks up in surprise. She quickly turns her face away and begs Prince Muan to take his leave. She is afraid that someone might come in at any time and see him. Just then, Prince Muan's guards come in carrying a deer. Seon and Unjeong watch in confusion as the guards drop the deer to the ground. However, Prince Muan doesn't look surprised. He orders the guards to start a fire for him. Seon turns to Prince Muan for an explanation, but he ignores her. Instead, he takes out a knife and cuts the deer open while the fire blazes. He uses a bowl to collect the blood, and he orders Seon to drink it. Seon looks at him uncertainty, and he informs her that she's to drink it to the last drop. Unjeong advises Seon to drink it out of fear. Seon hesitates again, and Prince Muan threatens to force her if she doesn't take it. Seon falls to her knees and collects the bowl of blood. She drinks it in it, and the taste makes her nauseous. Prince Muan hurriedly forces her to swallow it before she pukes. Seon swallows it and waits for Prince Muan's explanation. He explains to Seon that it's customary for a man and wife to share deer blood. He adds that he picked up the custom from a kingdom, which he conquered a while ago. Seon is appalled. She points out that this is not one of his conquests, and she is a concubine of the emperor. She tells Prince Muan to have some respect, and Prince Muan mocks her. He says he had no idea her fragile matrimonial bond was dear to her. Seon replies that the emperor would kill her if he finds out, and she tells Prince Muan that her blood would be on his hands. She adds that she would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Prince Muan bursts into laughter. He gives Seon an amusing look. He asks Seon to admit that she needs an ally in the palace. He offers to be her ally. As Seon watches Prince Muan, she wonders if their fates would have been different if she had escaped her horrid past. As Seon is lost in thoughts, one of Prince Muan's guard, Young, informs the prince that the deer meat is ready. Prince Muan grabs Seon's hand and uses a wet cloth to clean the blood. As he finishes up with the cleaning, he advises her to eat to her fill. Seon withdraws her hand and she clutches her dress nervously. However, she calls out to Unjeong to join her to eat. Unjeong is hesitant, but Seon tells her that it's impossible to undo all the events of the night, so it's better they enjoy a treat. Unjeong hesitates for a moment longer, then she goes to sit beside Seon. Prince Muan passes a large chunk of meat to Seon. He reminds her to be careful with it because it's still hot, and he urges her to eat. Seon stares at the meat for a while, then she chomps down hard on it. Unjeong watches Seon and follows her lead. Prince Muan smiles in satisfaction as Seon and Unjeong eat. Soon, they begin to discuss excitedly, and Seon suggests setting aside some meat for Hoyoung. Unjeong agrees it's a good idea, and Prince Muan overheads the conversation. He asks Seon who Hoyoung is, and she explains that he's a young eunuch that was assigned to her quarters a while ago. Prince Muan's guard, young, interrupts Seon. He asks her if the young eunuch she's speaking about is mute. Realization dawns on Seon. She replies that Hoyoung mentioned that he had a brother who left for war. She further adds that Hoyoung is sleeping in her bedchambers. Before Seon can complete her statement, Young jumps to his feet and runs towards Seon's own chambers. He throws open the doors and finds Hoyoung asleep on a futon, and he confirms that it's really his brother. Young quickly turns to Seon and asks her why his brother is asleep in her bedchambers. In his state of worry, he grabs her hands and begs her to explain what happened to his brother. He insists that he must know. Prince Muan interrupts Young coldly. He reminds him to know his place. Young realizes his rashness, and he lets go of Seon's hands. He bows and utters an apology to her. Seon smiles kindly. She assures Young that it's all right. Then she explains how Hoyoung took a caning from the concubine he served previously. She adds that she gave Hoyoung a sleeping draught so he can heal, but assures Young that Hoyoung would wake up soon. Seon informs Young that she'd let Hoyoung know about his visit when he wakes up. She let him know that he's allowed to visit Hoyoung whenever he pleases because Hoyoung would be staying in her quarters henceforth. Young bows to Seon in appreciation. When Seon sits down again, she gets lost in thought. Prince Muon notices and asks her what she's thinking about. Instead, Seon tells him that his presence in her quarters would incur the emperor's wrath. Prince Muon assures Seon that she doesn't need to worry about it. He reminds her that he is now her ally. Seon replies Prince Muan and tells him that her days in the palace are coming to an end, so she wouldn't be needing an ally. However, Prince Muon remains skeptical. He asks Seon to get used to him in the meantime, because he's sure she's going to need him. Later on, the emperor is deep in thoughts at the palace. News of Prince Muon's visit to Seon's quarters has reached him, and he ponders on the kind of relationship Prince Muon and Seon have. A thought occurs to the emperor, and he orders a eunuch to summon Seon. Seon is brought before the emperor in expensive regalia. She kneels by his side, and he places his hand on her head. A guest in the palace informed the emperor that the sight of Seon is heartwarming. He remarks that the emperor must really cherish his concubines. The emperor replies that he does, then he turns to Seon and asks her if she doesn't agree. The clothing she is wearing has been tailored to resemble the regalia of the empress. However, the emperor says he should have dressed Seon in the garbs of the courtesans instead. That, he claims, would have been a more delightful sight. Prince Muan sips tea and pretends not to notice. The emperor glares in Prince Muan's direction. To get a reaction from his brother, the emperor orders Seon to stand. He announces to his guests that the reason for the banquet is for generals who have extinguished themselves on the field of battle, so he feels obliged to make a proper introduction. He roughly pushes Seon forward, then he introduces her to his audience as the last Yeol. In surprise, one of the guests asks the emperor if Seon is really a Yeol. He reminds the emperor that all the Yeol people committed suicide, and it was a loss that greatly cost the kingdom. The emperor replies to his guest and informs him that all the Yeol impostors were weeded out before they died. He proceeds to make fun of the Yeol people and their deaths, and Seon clutches her clothing in silent anger. Suddenly, the emperor kicks her down the stairs, and she tumbles and falls on her face. He informs his audience that only because the rest of the Yeol were wiped out, he had no choice but to keep an abomination like Seon with him. Everybody in the room bursts out in laughter, but Prince Muon remains silent. He watches Seon on the ground as the other guests continue to laugh. Prince Muon rises and steps forward. He approaches Seon in the floor. He whispers a reminder to her that she needs an ally in the palace. Seon looks up at him as he grabs her and pulls her up. He whispers reassuringly to her, and the guests in the palace begin to murmur. Prince Muon approaches the emperor on the throne. He asks the emperor to forgive him for laying of a hand on his concubine. He says he simply could not neglect a beautiful woman in trouble. The emperor thinks for a moment before replying Prince Muon. He says it's impossible for him to refuse his brother when he makes a request. He reminds Prince Muan that the banquet was thrown in his honor, so he'd keep the night joyful by honoring his request. The emperor pretends to be nonchalantly, but he secretly grabs his chair in anger. He gives Prince Muan permission to leave with Seon. Seon rests in a private chamber, as she's attended to by a doctor. The doctor massages her ankle and advises Seon to be more vocal about her pain instead of trying to hide it. Seon assures the doctor that she's fine, and he gives her something to lessen the pain. He further advises her to take care. Seon shakes out her leg and tries to feel the area where she hurt it. She starts to thank the doctor when the emperor barges into the room with another concubine. He glares at Seon silently, and Seon is frightened by the hateful look. She falls to her face with the doctor to acknowledge the emperor. The emperor dismisses them in disgust. As Seon moves to leave with the doctor, the emperor orders her to remain, as he fondles the other concubine. If you want to see what happens next, drop a comment, or gives a thumbs up expressing your interest in a part 2. Your comments and likes helps determine if you're interested in really seeing a part 2. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Until next time, ciao.